Yeah, I know. It seems like every time we get you on, Danny, something absolutely insane is happening to the UK.
Well, exactly. My goodness me, the economics is quite a struggle right now to sort of understand what's going on. But sitting watching Rishi Sunak try to explain about his economic policies are quite
Danny,
interesting.
Danny, Matt, that's Matt's first question. So let let him do the intro, and then you can go into Rishi.
Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Election fever is in full swing, and as we record, manifestos are being launched every day. Polls are predicting a Labour landslide, and the remaining Conservative vote is being eroded by reform, and the other parties are fighting for the scraps. The economy, in many polls, remains the driving force for how people vote. And to discuss all things economics and more, we are joined tonight by friend of the pod, Professor Danny Blanchflower, CBE, Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College, part-time professor at the University of Glasgow, and former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, and of course, local Cardiff lad. Evening, Danny.
Hello, and I went to school in Cardiff. I went to Canton High, and I went and did my master's degree at University College Cardiff. And my grandparents were all born in Swansea, so I have this, strong connect. Oh, and the University of College Cardiff gave me an honorary doctorate. Oh no, they gave me an honorary fellowship. So there you go.
You've got a fantastic Welsh resume, Danny. You know, if you're not lucky, Labour will start putting you in some of their good parliamentary seats. So, Danny, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, no. Torsten Bell's got that one locked down.
So, Danny, thank you so much for coming back for the time to speak with us. As is part of the course, we usually talk a little bit about your previous predictions. How do you describe your thoughts about how Rishi Sunak would handle the UK economy when you spoke to us last?
Well, we're in a situation where certainly the economy has been very much flatlining. In fact, some evidence that it was in a relatively weak recession. Come out of that recession, growth looks pretty weak. We've seen today the unemployment rate has risen, wage growth a little bit sticky. I think it's pretty interesting that people don't feel good. And so the Prime Minister coming saying, I was the Chancellor. Well, okay, you were the Chancellor, but the economy isn't doing really very well. And people don't seem to believe him. I mean, they're between 20 and 26 points behind in the polls. And essentially now he has a reputation for ditching D-Day, in a sense, an absolutely epic place for an incumbent to go and get great pictures, and then basically trying to say things about Labour's economic strategy that was shown within 20 minutes to have been sort of made up. And so I think the credibility, and obviously the launch standing in Downing Street with the rain coming down and the pictures of him with the Mickey Mouse ears and talking, in a factory and in Wales, I believe, about how Wales are going to do in the Euros. And I mean, just looks like a complete disaster. And I saw today that the launch of the strategy, basically they didn't send Sunak out to answer questions. If presumably he's had to hide. But I think the public just doesn't really see that they can trust this government. I mean, there's been 14 years and they say things like, oh, we're going to do X and Y because this is a problem. And the problem they absolutely have is to say, well, if you were the Prime Minister, if you were the party in power for the last 14 years, why didn't you fix them over the last 14 years? So I think we were at very much an impasse. What's interesting with this weak economy and with an election coming is you often see polls narrowing. And Rob Ford has been really good on this and basically sort of said, well, I don't think that's actually going to happen. And if anything, they've widened. So you're right about the incumbents really, the incumbents are going to have to run on what the economy's been like and their past performance. But I wouldn't really run on that. The past performance looks like a disaster. I mean, you've had austerity, you've had Brexit, you've had recession, you've had inflation, you've had, confidence out of the window. And then, of course, there was Liz Truss, who tanked the market. So this is quite an astonishing history. And in a sense, in economics, it's so bad that I think that is what's driving the polls. The performance on the economy, a history that's so awful. And you hear Sunak saying, I want to think about the future. Well, of course you'd say that because the past is so bad.
Well, you talk about inflation, Danny, and obviously that was one of the big things we talked about last time we spoke. So, obviously Rishi Sunak and the Conservative government want to take a lot of credit for inflation falling, but how much responsibility does the UK government have for that?
How? What did they do? I mean, I've been asking this on Twitter endlessly. So the Prime Minister said, I have a plan. Okay. And I managed to get inflation down. So I teach a class called the financial crisis. So I set my students a task. Well, what actual policy did they actually put in place to get inflation down? Now, one possibility, obviously, is the Bank of England raised rates and global oil prices fell. So other than that, what did you do? And nobody's ever told me. I'm a professor of economics. I was on the MPC. If anybody knows, I should probably know. So you said, oh, they have a plan and they got it down. But nobody's actually ever been able to tell me what the plan was and what it was that actually got inflation down. So the conclusion you have to come to is actually they didn't get it down. It was just force of circumstance. The Bank of England is independent. Is it or is it not independent? And then global oil prices. How did Rishi Sunak get global oil prices down? So I certainly don't buy that was part of the plan. I mean, they can claim it, but I don't think anybody believes it. I certainly don't. And I've asked endless times for people to tell me, or I've asked Rishi Sunak, please tell me what it was. What was your plan that actually got it down? Can you guys tell me what it was in his plan that got it down? I bet you can't. No. A non-existent plan got it down. Then you say, look what I did. Well, sorry, you didn't.
Well, it's interesting you say that, isn't it? Because again, we've had numerous chats in the past about the impact that the Bank of England interest rates levels have had on inflation, whether they were right or wrong to do so. But why have they stayed as high as they have interest rates if inflation itself is coming down?
Yeah, well, inflation has obviously been pretty sticky. I mean, my view is that you were in recession. People really weren't feeling good. I mean, in a sense, if you are the Chancellor and you think you have the finger on the Bank of England's butt, certainly you should have been pushing them in the last 6 months or so to cut rates because, obviously there are all these people who come off tracker mortgages and are having to take higher mortgage today. I mean, I don't really understand it. I don't understand. Obviously, part of the story, we're seeing it happening in Europe with cuts coming there. In the United States, where I live, the expectation some time ago is that we're going to be 6 rate cuts. The answer is still that we haven't seen one, but again, this inflation is quite sticky. I think the biggest problem that I don't quite understand and economics doesn't understand is basically when you ask people about consumer confidence, how confident they are in the economy, they say not good stuff. And that's all suggestive that the economy will slow and they'll stop spending. And the global issue for economists is that despite the fact that they're gloomy about what they think is going on, they've still kept spending like gangbusters. And so that's a pretty interesting. So, just so everyone gets it, the spending during COVID was spending on goods. People bought stuff. They bought a gym for their home, but they stopped doing services. Since COVID's gone, people have stopped buying goods. There's been goods deflation around the world, and they've been taking services, taking cruises, going to the theatre, doing all kinds of stuff, and they've kept on doing that. And so that's been a puzzle, but that such ills as people feel, certainly in the UK, appears to be directed against the people who've been in office for 14 years and have failed to deliver. They haven't delivered on Brexit. They haven't delivered on the economy, haven't delivered on living standards, haven't delivered on schools, hospitals. 7 million people are on a wait list. You sit and you listen, and they launched it today at Silverstone, and I saw all these comments about, the first thing I saw was a picture of a car at Silverstone where both wheels came off. And I saw another one who called the thing this morning the pits. So the announcement was the pits this morning. And so, you can't write these stories. They're just so hopeless. You go and ask questions of people in a factory, and it turns out that the guy who asked the question is a plant from you. It's a councillor, but they found it out 5 minutes later. I do think that Rishi Sunak looks like the worst campaigner in the history of the world, and no wonder they're hiding him, poor fella. The deadly boy. So you went out to tell everybody you had a plan. You stood there and the rain came down on you. So why didn't you have a plan for an umbrella? It's like a killer question. And then he does the D-Day. So the economics is now paling into insignificance, into utter incompetence and laughability. Sorry, go on.
No. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we've seen a raft of poor announcements and poor set pieces, but obviously we've had today the Conservative manifesto, and that includes additional cuts to national insurance and income tax for pensioners, as well as a number of spending commitments, which total around, I think, £20 billion. is this the equivalent of another mini budget full of completely uncosted commitments, or do you think it's just a party that doesn't need to deliver on any of this?
But I think it's cloud cuckoo land stuff. I mean, it's, nobody believes they're going to be actually ever able to do any of this. And what's interesting, I mean, I see a number of commentators talking about the fact that, so there's this story about Labour's going to raise taxes by 2,000. But it's kind of interesting. All the analysis that I see is that the Tories are going to raise it by 4. How are you going to pay for this thing? There's clearly a hole in the public finances, or as set out by the government. But in a sense, I think if you talk to the people of Wales, the thing that I see, what do they see? Is tax cuts? Is tax cuts the thing that's really popular? I saw a column today. It said, you've delivered tax cuts, but how come that hasn't had any effect on it? I think after 14 years, people feel like the public potholes, there's potholes in the road, the schools aren't working, nothing's working, the hospitals are not working. It's time for a change. And I think that's change. I mean, I saw something else today, which said that Labour ministers are now not even going to seats which have 3,000 seat Tory majority. And it's not because they don't think they're winnable. They think it's better to go to seats which have 5,000 to 20,000 seat majorities. So I think, in a sense, the announcement that made is sort of irrelevant. They don't. I mean, that's the first thing. It's irrelevant because nobody believes what they're going to do. And the other thing is the Labour Party is interesting. It essentially hasn't said anything. I mean, there are lots of people like me, sympathetic economists and elsewhere, and they haven't talked to anybody. I mean, they don't have a secret plan. Their plan is to say, you're horrible, I'm against you, and we're going to say as little as we possibly can. So think of the story. You're going to say something about public-private schools, but are you actually going to think about, well, what happens if the kids come out of private school and they go to state school? They haven't really thought about it. So I think it's really about trying not to put your foot wrong, and the government in place, having a struggling economy, will say and do absolutely anything.
So I'm going to let Kerry deal with the Labour Party manifesto, but I got one more question before I hand over, Danny, which is, it feeds into the sort of discussion you've been having there with regards to tax and public services. Do you think that any of the political parties in the UK are being honest about tax?
No, not really. I mean, what's interesting sitting here from afar, I mean, how come you haven't had a conversation about Brexit? I mean, how can you have a conversation about tax until you work out exactly what you're going to do about Brexit? I mean, let's assume that the Labour Party is going to get in. So they made no conversation about it, but I assume they're going to start to think about, rejoining the customs union. I mean, I saw something yesterday, which may or may not be true, which is that Starmer's thinking about restoring freedom of movement. Well, those kinds of giant, I'm thinking about immigration, or think about all of those. If those policies are going to have a major impact, and they will impact any tax decision. So in a sense, what are we going to do has been put aside. And it is going to be about events, dear boy. I mean, essentially, the Labour Party is going to say, and has said, and I recommended that they do this, we didn't know really what to do. We didn't know what kind of a mess we were going to inherit from you, and we will see. But I think there's another thing which is interesting. Think about what happened in 1997. 3 days in, Gordon Brown and Ed Balls announced a cataclysmic decision, a huge decision, to sort of make the markets feel good, which was, we're going to make the Bank of England independent. And they announced it without any sort of anything in there previously thought through, and it had a positive effect. It lowered the cost of borrowing to the UK. My suspicion is that Labour are not going to spring on us something like, Wales is going to have a central bank of its own or something. I don't think they're going to do that.
No. Okay, let us know that. As Matt mentioned, I'm going to touch on Labour, and Labour haven't launched their manifesto just yet. There's bits and pieces that have been announced in the press. There's corporation tax rate is going to stay at the current cap of 25%. Business rates is interestingly going to be replaced by an unknown specified new system of property taxation. You've got energy profits levy is going to go up by 3%. But what they're suggesting is, but we're not going to have big changes from the current Conservative approach. Is that your take as well?
Well, my take is that's what they should say. Right? That's exactly what they should say. We just go, well, we'll accept all the things that you've said because A, we don't want to create banana skins for ourselves. We don't want to do, the thing before where, what was in 1992, where you celebrate the victory before you've had it. And then I think, then you look and see where you are. I mean, the problem in a way is public expectations are something they're going to have to read. I mean, my sense is, you're living in the Rhondda. What are you going to think about? You're going to say, well, we need to fix the health service. We need to fix the schools. We need to fix the roads. And we need to try and help people who are struggling. Those pressures are going to be extremely intense. I mean, think of child poverty, those kinds of things. So the Labour Party is not going to, once it gets into office, it's not going to be able to avoid the pressure to try and, do a reverse Osborne, to do a reverse Robin Hood. I mean, we've seen the reverse Robin Hood. You take from the poor and you give to the rich. Well, Robin Hood comes into power and everybody goes, okay, now we've got Robin Hood. Great. So I think the answer is that we are going to see the expectations are going to be a really big deal. What's he going to do about, once he's in office, he's inherited these issues, what's Rachel going to do? Well, Rachel's tried very hard to be a stern conservative with a small c. My bet is that won't hold, and they're going to have to do something bold. And the bold, because the people are going to want bold. It'll be a function, of course, I think, of the scale of the victory, right? I think, Kerry, I think that's really going to be a big part of it, right? If the Tories are down to 50 seats, then you can pretty much do what you want. And so I think the political reality. But the problem about it, go back to a second, the problem about when you want to implement something, you've got to have the policies in place, the ideas in place, and actually implement and have the ability to do that. And that takes time. My hope was that they've been secretly preparing lots of stuff for going forward. I have no sense that they've done that. I can maybe be completely wrong, but if they had, I think professors of economics around the country would know, and we don't know. They're going to tread lightly. They're going to try and not. I mean, they learn from trust, right? You can't go in and make stupid statements, stupid announcements that, the last thing you want is to crash the markets again. So they're certainly going to come in and be cautious, and should be, and consider things. But I don't think any of those things can happen very quickly. So what you've talked about is fiddling at the edges, right? I mean, in the sense, supposing you decide two things, you say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to fix the NHS and we're going to do something about kids. It's a lot of billions going to have to go into that.
There's a lot of billions. I think, as Matt alluded to, it's about that tax story, because I think that's the soundbite. What do you think they can do? So I think cash is king in that next administration. We're going to need a lot of it.
Well, I mean, I think, I've always taken the view that fiscal rules are sort of made up fiscal rules. I mean, there's nothing in economics to say you have to have this fiscal rule. I mean, the sound economics is this. Supposing instead of it being Wales, let's think of it as Wales PLC, right? So the thing you ask is, should Wales borrow money? Should Wales PLC borrow money to invest in things, right? So you say, well, obviously Wales PLC shouldn't borrow masses of money and have a party and blow it. But supposing Wales PLC could think of really good investments. So, I don't know, infrastructure, people, help make people more productive. So Wales borrows money. It borrows £100 billion at, 5%. And it comes up with investments that pay a return of 10%. Should it do it? Yes. It's not about what the borrowing is. The whole debate has got wrong on this. The debate is, what do you spend it on? And what are the, how quickly can you implement it? But the idea that people should worry about the borrowing is not the point. Wales PLC doesn't worry about the borrowing. If it borrows at 5% and invests in things at 10%, its share price rises, right? So the amount of borrowing is irrelevant. It's what it does with it. It's how it spends it. Now, obviously, think about HS2. You spend the money. It's a huge amount of money. That's probably not a smart way to spend it. You blew it. Well, the question then is not so much what you borrow, it's at what price you borrow it and what you spend it on. In America, no one talks about fiscal rules. I mean, there are state rules about whether you can run budget deficits. But I think that whole debate, I mean, think of the idea You have 7 million people on the National Health Service wait list. Would it be a good investment to try and make the population healthier, wealthier, and more productive? Probably, right? So I think I don't really buy that entire debate. My Wales PLC one is a good way of thinking of it. Depends what you spend it on. And so no one asked that. How much did they buy? What did you spend it on?
So here's a question for you now. You mentioned HS2. That's a touchy subject in Wales because
Yeah,
we're owed about 5 billion in Barnett consequentials,
right.
but that'll be for another day. But one of the most pressing aspects in Wales at the moment, I'm not sure if you've picked up on it, is the closure or the changes around Port Talbot blast furnaces.
Yes, of course, I know. Yeah, I used to belong to Royal Porthcawl Golf Club and Pyle and Kenvig just up the road from there. So I know Port Talbot very well. Stood on Pyle and Kenvig and could look across at it. So I know that.
Both those courses, you can see that huge expanse of
Yeah,
industry there. But
yes.
what do you think when you mentioned about that kind of borrowing and the big ticket items? Do you think, as it's being suggested by Welsh government, but wait for a new UK government and Labour will be there to kind of underwrite the continuation of pure blast furnaces at that site?
Well, obviously the question is, I mean, I always think of this as being, so if you think back to banks in the Great Recession, the banks that failed. I mean, in a sense, the role of a central bank is to help illiquid, but banks that are still viable, still commercially viable, right? I mean, the question in a sense is markets will work. How important is it for you to protect those communities, and at what price? I always look back, Kerry, look back, go and watch the Full Monty. The Full Monty was about the closure of steel plants in Sheffield, right? And I always think back to under Thatcher, what happened was a million male manual workers who were union members in the north lost their jobs because they closed steel plants and coal mines and so on. And what happened to them? The answer was they never worked again. So the consequence of allowing large plants and stuff to close without something to replace them would be a nightmare. I mean, one of the big stories, if you go back, since Thatcher, there haven't been giant plants in places that have closed. So I think Labour's going to have to work out how to protect it, and protect it in the best possible way, and protect those jobs, because without it, what are you going to do? The community collapses. So I think it's quite clear that you should wait and see what the next government's doing. But my view would be you can't allow steel plants to close. I mean, the other thing as well, Gary, go back to what did we learn from COVID? We learned under COVID that you can't just allow your supply chains to disappear, right? You can't just say, oh, well, we'll import the steel from Korea, because when you get to COVID and the supply chains close, that whole globalization thing has got you in trouble. So I think the Labour Party has to think about not allowing, trying to think about we need to. I mean, it's an island nation, right? When I was brought up, I remember studying in Cardiff thinking about, what's it called? The commanding heights of the economy. And the commanding heights in an island were, sitting on the island, you need to control steel production, car production, the roads, water, electricity, and the railways. Well, that whole debate is coming back around. The railways and water, the whole set of debates. And I think the public's view on, maintaining that infrastructure is part of the reason why the Tories are in trouble, because the public don't share their view that you can farm it out to your pals. So I take the view, absolutely, you should not allow that place to close. You've got to work out the best way to do it, how it is through a public or private partnership. Just as you're going to have to sort out water, electric, and rail, right? Labour's going to have to do something about sewer in the rivers and sewer on the beaches, and how they best do it. The answer is how they best do it. They're going to have to do it quite quickly, and you would hope that they have a view. Suddenly on day 4, they go, okay, this is what we're going to do about water, because they can't sit there and say, let's do something about water. It'll take them a year to work out what to do. There's an urgency about not allowing those plants to close. You need them. They are the commanding heights. You need to be able to make sure if supply chains lock.
My kind of thinking on the questions is leading into, you mentioned that globalization there, Danny, about and few countries are at the center of global trade and commerce as Britain, and we've certainly moved in that direction. So are we really now at the whims of that global economy? So the likes of Tata in Port Talbot or Jaguar Tata at the new electric battery plant in Bridgewater, or Toyota, these global corporate behemoths are dictating a lot of our economic aspects.
Well, yeah, you can't buck the market, right? And you obviously, in a sense, think about so I worked for a long time, and the world has changed a bit, but I worked a lot on, the well-being of prime age, less educated folks, and the implications of the globalization has been in places like Wales and in the US and so on. What you've done is you've basically allowed those jobs to disappear away, and you didn't replace them. But the globalization meant that you were susceptible to global themes. So think of a global financial crisis. If you're in a global economy, everybody gets it. So obviously there's been a rethink about trade and about how independent a country is. And I think that in a sense, Keir, the conversation has to be about to what degree are you going to allow yourself to become global, and how much protection are you going to have? And the truth is, in the Great Recession, countries that had most exposure to global markets and under COVID were hurt the most. So you've got to try and protect yourself. I mean, think about, they used to argue it was about countries that had unions that were hurt. Well, actually, countries with unions did best. They were the ones who did best, not did the worst. So, I mean, the whole globalization argument is going to have a rethink, because yes, there are benefits from being able to buy things from Walmart, but maybe the consequence is that there's no jobs for the people who buy from Walmart. So I think that, I mean, I agree with you that these are huge issues, and obviously, issues to what degree protection you're going to have. Trump in the US is talking a lot about protecting aluminum and cars and so on.
We're gonna come on to Trump, Danny. Don't worry about that.
Oh Lord. Okay, so we're on the same page, but the details are going to matter. Some kind of private-public partnership. Clearly, they're not going to nationalize them and have a nationalized steel industry as we did, but some way of protecting jobs and protecting the furnaces seems absolutely crucial, because otherwise you're exposed to the global this, that, and the other. The exchange rate's going to hit you. I think we learned that allowing those places to close was an error. I mean, go back to the coal. Think about when I was in college in the 70s, hundreds of thousands of coal miners. In Britain, there are about 28 of them now. But what happened in those communities when the coal went away? What happened in the Rhondda? What came to the Rhondda? I mean, Barry, I think, was the #1 port in the world in 2000 and in 1913, I think it was. Well, change and technology comes, but if you allow one set of things to go, you have to bring other things in. But you need to have a steel industry.
To what extent, Danny, do you think these sort of this globalization and also sort of the politics of discontent and the economics of discontent as well are responsible for the rise of quote unquote far right parties both across Europe and in the UK?
So I remember my dear friend Alan Kruger, who sadly died a year or so ago, and he was talked about, well, what was the benefit of globalization? The benefit of globalization was that prices fell, right? So in some sense, the benefit of immigration is the same as that. So people in Los Angeles like immigration because the price of their, doing their gardens and having their cars cleaned. So on the one hand, people benefited. You and I could go to Walmart and I could buy a pen in Walmart for 1/10 of what I could pay before. Okay. But what did we do? And Alan Kruger's view was what we did was the winners didn't compensate the losers enough. And the losers, so I think everyone in the country gains. 330 million people in America gain, and 5 million people lose because their jobs have gone. So what did we do? Well, we could have compensated. And imagine, just make it up. Imagine we gave each of those 5 million people $1 million each. That's a lot of money, but actually it turns out that might have been a really smart thing to do, because the losers then say, well, okay, you guys, but look at me, I'm struggling here. I haven't, we've done nothing to help the losers. So you might argue that the winners didn't compensate the losers enough. So compensating the losers might be send them to training, but not just training to go and be a delivery driver, real training. I mean, real training. So if you think of that, I think absolutely the winners didn't compensate the potential losers, who then said, look at me. And then they look for, think about, they look for alternatives. Think about what Keynes said in the Treaty of Versailles. Keynes left it was a representative there and resigned from it because he said the reparations are so much on Germany, they're so serious that that they can't possibly pay, and there's going to be, response to that, which turns out there was. So if you learn anything from losers, I mean, I don't mean in a pejorative way. I just mean there are winners and losers. So people who not, I mean, same thing with the thing of Brexit. The country benefits from having 3 million Poles who can be plumbers and all the rest of it. But the plumbers were not happy because it lowered the price of being a plumber. Okay, so then what's happened is that because the winners didn't compensate the losers enough, that pushed people to right-wing parties and to opposition to Trump in the US, Brexit in the UK. And the problem is that the things they hoped and wanted for have not been able to be delivered because they were never going to be deliverable. But we could have compensated them more.
I'm going to quickly come in though, just on that Versailles, simply because my Welsh history, it always amazes me. But one of the big outcomes of Versailles was Germany was able to pay reparations in coal, and it had a massive impact on Wales in the 20s.
On Wales. At the same time as the oil-powered ships were coming in, and so the demand for coal globally was down, and the British Navy weren't using it anymore. And we did say, if I just said to you, 1913, Barry Docks was the number one busiest docks in the world. By 1921, it wasn't anymore. And so you want to be really careful wiping out coal. I mean, I just go back to the full Monty. A million male manual workers in the north. Thatcher paid for them with North Sea oil. Norway didn't do that, and they got themselves the second biggest sovereign wealth fund. So what you should have done was invest that money and think of those people and give them jobs and give them work, not basically spend unemployment benefits for 1 million people forever. We're on the same page, right?
It's really interesting because one of the party that sort of disenfranchised angry voter seems to be heading towards in the UK is Reform. Now, I don't know if you've seen this story today, but Patrick Minford has been announced as Reform UK's main economic guru.
Oh, gosh.
And obviously, his economics don't really seem in keeping with a vision of the future economy that would actually benefit a lot of these discontented voters.
I'll give you 2 stories. There was a famous story by Margaret Thatcher who talked about austerity, and somebody asked her if she could name 2 economists that backed her. And Alan Budd was one of them, and Patrick Minford was the other. And apparently she said on the taxi on the way home, back to Downing Street, good job they didn't ask me for 3. But the other story, in a way, which is pretty interesting, is that Patrick Minford, I recall, I mean, I've battled with him forever, and I don't think Patrick Minford ever said a single sensible thing. But I do recall him saying when Brexit was coming, it would have 2 impacts, which he thought were really good. The first one was that it would wipe out British agriculture, and secondly, it would wipe out British manufacturing. So if you're going to hire someone who has that kind of view of things, you're probably on a hiding to nothing. So, I mean, the third thing I would say, quite often I would be asked when we had the Brexit debate, and maybe I made a mistake, I would say there were 10,000 economists who thought Brexit was a bad idea and 4 who didn't. And the BBC particularly used to say, let's have I mean, Emily Maitlis has talked about this, let's have a balanced discussion. So they would always put Patrick Minford on. And then I would get asked to go on with him. And I'd say, I'm not going on with him. He's a crackpot. And so a lot of us, the 10,000, actually basically refused to go on because we're not going to go debate with a crackpot. Maybe that was a mistake because it allowed him to say crackpot things. And quite often I talk to journalists in the BBC and I'd say, well, he's a crackpot. And they go, really? So I think the answer is that, fortunately, Reform will deliver about as many MPs as they currently have, and Patrick Minford will go into oblivion as a waste of space.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people are predicting that Nigel Farage may actually win that seat, and he may have at
a ninth time of passing, and he might meet the man in a dolphin suit doing it again, standing against him again.
But he may have some, if elected, and even if not elected, he probably will have quite a significant influence on the Conservative Party.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, but look at the movements we've seen in the last 3 days in Europe, and we've seen it in France, and Macron has called an election. I mean, it's clear that there are moves, there are people who are discontented, and who are offering things to the discontented. I mean, in America, listen, obviously we're going to talk a little about Trump, but the discontented want a place to go. I mean, a lot of them are saying, he's God, Jesus did this, and these are desperate times. I think I would characterize it, and I've worked quite a lot on it. I would characterize it as the left behinds. I mean, think about. Let's think about what Cardiff University, the University of Cardiff. What does it do? So it raises lifetime incomes of people who come to study there. It helps ease the transition from school to work. And what's happened is that the earnings distribution has widened in every occupation. The top 10%, the gap between them and the median has risen over time. So what you've seen is rising inequality, rising returns to skills, rising returns for education, rising returns to working in the financial sector. And the comparator for the less educated has become worse and worse and worse as they look at TikTok and other things. So the potential for them, the hope for them in many ways is gone. So it's a lack of hope, someone who speaks to you, and of course there are analogies to the past. I mean, there are analogies back to Brexit, which is we offer you things and we haven't delivered. I mean, so that's obviously a big thing. The 50 Labour seats that went, the cities that voted for Brexit. I mean, I always think of at the time, think of the British seaside towns, Southend, Clacton, I mean, or Blackpool. What was the great? They all voted, apart from Brighton, I think, Torquay, Bournemouth, Llandudno, I think. They all voted. I mean, Wales voted for Brexit. It was always a complete. I mean, Wales was always going to lose from it. It was no doubt whatsoever. The place in Europe, one of the poorest places in Europe, the place that was going to lose the most, voted to hurt themselves. So, in desperation, people look to somebody who offers them things. But Wales was always the place above all places that shouldn't have voted for Brexit, just in economic terms, about the amount that they had to lose.
What impact do you think the thought, let's call it that, of Patrick Minford would have on the Conservative chances of becoming electable again, say, if they do go down to the defeat they're about to have?
Oh, I don't think Patrick Minford, and that suggests that Patrick Minford has any influence. I don't think he does.
It's always a worry that Patrick is a Cardiff University professor, I believe. But look, let's move away from the UK. You mentioned some of the issues in Europe this week, Danny. I think we'll look at those another time. But you're based in the US now, the land of the free and the land of Donald Trump. What's that like at the moment?
But I live in a state called New Hampshire, which is the motto in New Hampshire is live free or die. I always thought it's much better to say live free or move, but whatever. So keep going, live free or die. Yeah, so we're dealing with the world of Donald Trump, twice impeached. What is it? Now a convicted felon, indicted 91 times. And the polling looks pretty close currently. Obviously, the economics is pretty interesting. I mean, what's interesting now is that essentially Trump has made this entirely about himself. It's unclear. If you said to me, what are his economic plans? What strategy does he have? Well, it's about retribution. It's about, we'll deport 10 million people on day one that I get into office, and I will, and I'll imprison my political opponents, and I'll put people in place who are going to, make things all better. It's back to the 365 million quid a week we'll find for the NHS. But the issue, obviously, is that there are a lot of people that are hurting, a lot of people in a way that Trump benefited. People feel like the stock market did well. But if you look in the data, under Biden, on any kind of quantitative measure you come up with, the economy's been better under Biden than it was under Trump. As I say, the stock market, I mean, I spend some time with the students, and I say, well, if you go and look at if you may think the economy in the US, people say, I think it's in recession. I think the unemployment rate's bad. But one of the things I think is pretty interesting is I have to take my iPhone here, and I just click on the button which says stocks, and you click on the Dow Jones, and you can click on it and you say, well, what's happened to the Dow Jones over the last year? And it's gone up from 34,000 to 40,000. So people say things like, the perception is that they'll say, the majority of people in the US say the stock market's down. Well, it's up. I mean, there's the picture. It's up by an awful lot. So, okay, people's perceptions are one thing. People have listened to Trump. They go to those rallies. They've done a lot about saying, that Biden's a doddering fool. But But I think that the battle in the end is going to come down to people saying, and people in the suburbs saying, what's happened? Am I better off? And obviously, some of the big deals are going to be, the Roe v. Wade was overturned, so women are a big problem for Trump, and they're trying to do all kinds of stuff. But in the states where the election is going to be done, I think the Supreme Court and those kinds of actions are a really big deal. But it's unclear really to this point what economic strategy he has. And on the other hand, the Biden economy is doing really well. I mean, again on Friday we had 270,000 jobs again in the non-farm payroll. So just so readers, listeners know, every month the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, releases the most important data release in the world, which is basically the job numbers for the United States. And the unemployment rate's been below 4. The job numbers have been stellar, absolutely stellar. But in a sense, the question is, well, why do people not think that? Why, when the data is quantitatively strong, do they not see it? And you could argue that it's about media. You could argue that the data's not good and not picking up real things. But, essentially, if you say the stock market's down, that's quantitatively something we can look at. And I'm looking at it here, and it was 34,000 in October, and today it's 39,000. So obviously this is a puzzle. But the politics here, I suspect we're going to, obviously one of the big deals is that apparently today Trump had to go in front of his probation officer.
Would have been good to see it be a fly on the wall in that one, actually, Danny. But
obviously so that in a sense, go back to the British one. Sunak is driving this thing, and his banana skins are a big deal. But Trump got made was found guilty on 30-odd counts and is a convicted felon. And some of them are saying. So I heard one of the commentators today say he's an old guy, and you should allow him not to have to go to prison. And you say, well, okay, if he's an old guy, he's too old to be kept out of prison, be put in prison. How come you think he should be president? You can't have it both ways. If he's too doddery to go to jail, but you still think it's okay for him to be president. So obviously these political things are a big deal, but people clearly are hurting. And the other story, which perhaps I could just jump in, is that I've been working a lot and writing about it a lot, which is the collapse in the well-being of the young, which is something we're really going to have to deal with. And obviously part of this story I think is relevant is that Starmer has a sense of it, which is that whether you agree with it or whether you don't, that giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote. I mean, if you're in a period where the well-being of the young is really going down, it's not even clear which way they're going to go. But I think this is a major issue in Wales and other places we're now going to have to deal with globally. There's a huge collapse in the well-being of the young since around 2015. That probably in the next 2 or 3 years is going to dominate the whole economic and social debate. How are you going to deal with the fact that 1 in 10 of your students at the university are in deep trouble, especially the young women?
I think there's a lot over the rest of this decade which we could pick your brains about, Danny. AI at the moment is particularly interesting, and I'm sure you've got thoughts on that. But we'll have to bring you back for that. We're coming to the end of our time with you at the moment.
Sure.
One final question is, just your take, your crystal ball. Where do you see things going in the UK, both at the election and then the first 6 months of I think it's going to be a new administration. How do you see that? And then also, in the US, where do you see that going up until November?
Wow, what a question. Well, let's start with the UK. I mean, obviously the expectations are going to be very high on this new administration. Starmer is certainly not a Tony Blair. I think what we're going to see is trying to play for time. But I think the way I would think of it is, well, presumably what we're going to see is the Bank of England are going to start cutting rates. They would probably be doing so right in the June meeting if there hadn't been an election. So I think you're going to start to see some of that. But I think you're going to start to see movements to things that perhaps were unthinkable. I certainly think the big thing that I'm expecting to see is some easing of tensions and relations with Europe. And obviously there's an issue which is, they've gone to the right too, but I think there's going to be issues of customs union, the common market, tolls, lines at the Dover. How do you deal with the fact that basically, I was listening to people saying we used to have lots of European customers. We don't have any today. Well, the way this is going to work is to strengthen those relations. So I think we're going to see movements of things that have not been documented, because that's what they're going to have to do. And the other big deal is how you're going to deal with the National Health Service. What are you going to do? And I think that people are going to want to see that. When I was listening to it, there was a GP talking to Sunak the other day saying there are thousands of us unemployed GPs who would like to try and solve this problem where people can't get appointments. Well, for goodness sake, Labour, go sort this out. Go hire them. We have to think of the problem first. And obviously, people will say, well, how do you pay for it? Well, because if you're not paying for it, the country's collapsing. You have to find means to pay for it. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing in the US is that it does feel that there's quite a conflict in the air. I mean, the stuff with the Supreme Court and basically two extreme right-wing members of the Supreme Court trying to, very much pro-Trump, and trying to sort of, and the laws and the courts sort of blocking what's going on. The country feels very divided. So I think that really matters. But I think the surprising strength of the economy does have potential weaknesses. I certainly think things like the commercial property sector is a big deal, and it's surprising that it's held off for so long, and the economy has done surprisingly well. If that can be maintained, I suspect that Biden in the end will cakewalk it. I mean, because Trump just, I mean, they can't, he's not going to go to the debate, I don't think, because I don't think he can go and do that. He's becoming, I mean, if you listen to his ramblings and craziness, I think, I mean, we're at the position, I think now, where 41 of his 44 cabinet secretaries, when he was president, have refused to support him. There's issues about the military and what he said about the military. And in the end, I think we're going to start to see when people suddenly think about where are they going to vote, they're going to ask the question, are you better off than you were in 2020? And the answer is yes. And the people who didn't vote, here's the big deal, I think, in the US, people who didn't vote for Trump in 2020, what reasons are there for them to vote for him now? And obviously, since 2020, there's been 4 years of young people reaching the age of 18, right? And those people are very strongly anti-Trump. And so we'll see. But obviously, there are interesting issues about if you say I'm going to deport 10 million people, how come his support amongst Hispanics and blacks is not that? I mean, how come Biden's support is not that great? So there are interesting things going on, I think. But we will see. It could go one way or the other. But the polling, unlike the polling is pretty interesting, but I think it's likely to move as sanity prevails. I think a crucial thing will be, will Trump actually get to the debate?
Danny, thank you so much for all your insight. We normally ask our guests when we close about their preferred social media handle. And since we spoke to you last, you've actually been let out of Twitter jail, haven't you?
Yeah, and I actually was let out of Twitter jail, and they wrote to me and said, well, we're really sorry, we kicked you out because of a mistake. I'm like, okay, that's fine. And I'm back stirring up trouble, snapping at the heels of complacency. I have 114,000 followers, and I think it's Camilla Tumney who has been going at it. And I wrote something yesterday about for the first time I wrote a tweet which had 1.2 million views, which I thought was like a wow, because I basically said, so I was interested in the whole debate about, oh, we're at private schools and we're really upset that we might have to pay more money for it. And I wrote, well, sell your house, sell the silver, get a second job, don't go skiing this winter, stop whining. And in any case, after 14 years, you probably should have prepared yourself for the possibility that the worm was going to turn at some point and the workers will come after you with pitchforks. And so he got 1.2 million views, which I quite like. It's causing trouble again.
And if people want to find that,
at @T_Blanchflower.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Danny. It's been an absolute pleasure again. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hereith on all the socials at HereithPod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/HereithPod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.